welcome. So I'm just going to do a little kind of response video to the US election results and just show you exactly like almost do like a history of the 21st century. It's a very specific kind of history um, and kind of explain to you why I was able to predict that this would happen and why I've just been more generally leaning towards the side of analysis and commentary that is saying that the kind of um, style of governance and culture that we've come to know in the 2010s in particular um, is going to, I think, adapt, alter, and wind down over the next few years unless some extreme event happens, and even then, possibly not. So there's generally kind of two forms of commentary or analysis which are going on, at least in the circles that I sort of encounter on the internet, Twitter, and so on, which are pretty much the only thoughtful, for the most part, sources out there today. Um, but in regards to like Western, particularly American, um, kind of culture and politics, and how things are going to continue to go into the next over the next decade or two or three. And one side kind of says like to use the term wokeness, like it's a new religion. It's like Christianity emerged from Rome or something like that, and it's going to last indefinitely. And the kind of system is super strong and powerful, and that's the way it's going to go for the indefinite future. The other side of analysis here is something more like um, this the kind of regime in the U.S. in particular is going to sort of alter and adapt, and there's some sort of significant change happening, and the culture at large, the politics, the values, and so forth are going to adapt, and this kind of woke, progressive, neoliberal era that we've been in, particularly in the 2010s, is coming to an end. And I tended to lean more towards the latter analysis and prediction. And as this election between this the second election between Trump and Harris, or sorry, the first election between Trump and Harris, but the second time Trump has succeeded in claiming the White House, I've sort of also been drawn towards this analysis that um, things are going to change a bit and alter in some form or another. And I think Trump's victory does prove that, because if Trump was elected once, for example, it can be put down to the Democratic Party had an extremely bad 4 years. They made a mistake. The system sort of needed time to adapt to various changes in the society, phenomena, problems, geopolitical tensions, the negative effects of deindustrialization, the kind of excessively progressive culture, kind of the kind of culture wars and all that stuff. Um, the kind of the kind of main systems of power. We're talking the post-war systems of power, the center left, the center right, and eventually what became the kind of neoliberal, neoconservative centers of power needed time to adapt to the changes in the media, from the mainstream media to the internet. They needed time to respond to the negative aspects of an excessively sort of kind of progressive culture, and the negative effects of deindustrialization and the geopolitical stuff. But actually, what Trump's victory has proved that they haven't learned anything and they haven't adapted, and any adaptation seems to be coming in from these sort of outside figures. So people like, obviously Trump is an outside figure for the American political establishment. You've even got like RFK Jr., who about 10 years ago would have just been dismissed as a lunatic, questioning science, questioning vaccines, questioning. 10 years ago, he would have just been dismissed like a lunatic, and he was for the most part. Now he's well. We'll see how it goes. Of course, I do remain kind of cautiously skeptical of the capacity for Trump and the Trump regime to actually implement policy. I do remain skeptical of that, but I do think that at least morally and ideologically, the fact that he will openly advocate for someone like RFK is quite significant. Um, for me, RFK is the most significant figure in all of this, but still, I think I'm not as impressed with Musk. But nonetheless, he is an outside figure. He is someone who's not really, even though he's a one of the world's richest men, or whatever, he's not really like politically, intellectually, institutionally accepted among the super elites. Even though even though the military-industrial complex and the military complex at large probably does look at him as somewhat potentially useful given his kind of technological resources with like weapons development and all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm not saying he's a very subversive figure, but there is nonetheless, I think, a sort of change in the morality and psychology of the culture at large, which is going on at the moment, which is what I'm going to try analyze to a certain extent here. Okay, so I did something extremely autistic, and literally made a graph of 21st century up till this moment. I began with 2005, which maybe isn't the best thing to do because one of the most important events of 21st century, which was 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, is all happened in that first 5 years. So I acknowledge that, but I am going to just start from 2005 because I think uh, just just for the sake of this little video, I think it's fine to start with that. So basically, what you have here is uh, an emotional energy graph of the first quarter, because we're coming up on the first quarter of the 21st century, and you see you see the crazy woman screaming, uh, who's become a kind of meme nowadays. This woman in the green jacket screaming, who was screaming after the first Trump victory, and she's kind of like peak, kind of excessive high energy, and then you have Marcus Aurelius down there at the bottom, so he's like pure kind of stoic control, and then so Marcus Aurelius is -1, and this lady is like 1. So this kind of represents two ends of a balance, a kind of spectrum of balance, and 0 is kind of in the middle, and 0 would be the standard kind of level of energy that a modern society is operating within at any given time. And I do think at the start of the 21st century, we were basically around a healthy balance of energy. If not, we were even probably a little bit more towards the Marcus Aurelius side. If I was to go back, say, to 1995, perhaps we were even a little bit towards that kind of stoic end of the spectrum there. But anyway, as you go into 21st century, things get a bit crazy, and the first thing you'll see there on the map is '08 crash. So 2008 '08 crash. This intensified things uh, more obviously because, well, the whole kind of financial system was suddenly called into question, and you had the emergence of populism, or originally left-wing populism, and you had the kind of repoliticization and kind of rehistoricization of Western society after this kind of end of history, 90s, early 2000s period, where for the most part, I mean, with some exceptions, for the most part, things are pretty kind of well managed and boring and kind of normal. And Then you have an '08 crash, so you have an intensification of people's kind of political, social concerns, intensification of anger, a suspicion and a dislike of the status quo and of the authorities and so on and so forth. Things kind of then simmer down a little bit. You see after that 2008 crash towards 2010, early 2010s, I think things sort of like simmered a little bit. That energy went away, and then as you go into the 2010s, things just get more and more and more and more crazy to the point like 2015, 2016 onwards, you're just like in this pure crazy high energy sort of culture, and you get all these symptoms of like culture wars and cancellations, and people are very kind of very much synchronized emotionally into the culture in a much more intense way than we were before. Now, will just point out here that when we're talking about this high energy 2010s period, we are talking about a certain style of high energy. We are talking about a kind of liberal middle class, very effeminate, very hysterical style of high energy. There are other forms of high energy that you could point towards in history. The early 20th century was a very very high energy peak in society, and it was much more masculine and so forth. So this is kind of stylized in many ways by a kind of pre-existing character of the culture, which goes back further than all of this. We do have in the late 20th century a sort of feminization of the work environment to kind of move away from post-industrial, sorry, from industrial to post-industrial, and a movement away from kind of, we have a post-war period, so we don't have like national service, and warfare is not a very kind of common normal thing to expect in Western society. So you have this sort of a feminization and this kind of and also a kind of middle class uh, styling of the character of Western society in, basically from the end of World War II onwards. Anyway, but the difference is, as soon as we run into trouble now with '08 crash, financial crashes, and cultural tensions and so forth, um, and of course then later on, as I'll point out, COVID and the Ukraine war and geopolitical changes and so forth, the expression of that high energy is going to be an expression of a pre-existing character, which is much more which is much closer to this lady here than it is to like, I don't know, like Lenin, Hitler, or like Napoleon or whatever, So that's just something that is worth pointing out. So you might be asking yourself, why is the graph kind of going down? So you got this like super high intense period from like 2016, 2015, um, and it starts to go down like 2018, 2019, as Trump wins the first victory. I think it goes up, and then as his 4 years plays out, it starts to, I think, kind of go down, and then with COVID, it peaks again for a bit, but then it's going down again, and then you have the second Trump victory. This is the way I'm conceptualizing this. Now, this is all completely speculative, right? This is kind of based off observations. So I'm not saying this is like some concrete statistical analysis or something like this, but this is exactly the point. I don't trust concrete statistical analysis because this doesn't understand the world we're living in. If you did like a survey and said like, what kind of energy level are you operating under on a day-to-day basis, you're not going to get a concrete answer. Or if you did like a kind of opinion poll, you're not going to get a proper answer, because this is the old way of looking at things. The philosopher Paul Virilio said that the 20th century and the 19th century was a period where the culture and the media try to standardize our opinions. So it's trying to standardize our opinions, whereas the 21st century is all about synchronizing our emotions. And this is the product of, for him at least, largely the change in the media landscape. We no longer like read newspapers. We look at images on a screen. It's much more emotional. It's much more visceral. It's much more audio visually stimulating and less kind of. It's less of a process of the kind of rational part of our psyches, and it's much more of a process of the emotional parts of our psyches. And instant communication, constantly being in kind of instant communication with people, constantly knowing everything that's happening in the world very, very instantaneously. If there's like a pandemic or there's a kind of a cultural phenomena, everything's filmed, everything's reported, and it's kind of sent around the world very quickly. So we're much more emotionally synchronized into the media landscape and the systems of communication than in previous times where we were more rationally sort of engaging with it, less emotionally. Now it's the opposite. It's more emotional and less rational. Of course, this is not for everybody. This doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of people who are still using their reason. It just means that I think for the most part, this is largely true. So so um, uh, you have this period, and like the interesting thing about this graph is this, right? If you think about it this way, the '08 crash and the COVID and also Ukraine war, these are actually the kind of peak events um, of the 21st century. If you leave out 9/11, of course, but but these two events are the peak kind of events so far in the first quarter of the 21st century. Why is it that like kind of it's in between these two things where you have the high intensity, sort of super volatile, sort of hyper hysterical, emotionally wound, crazy ass kind of culture, and not like in the middle of them. It's kind of in between them. These events are like bookmarks. Well, I think it's basically because um, these events sort of initiate the end to the entire kind of post-war liberal paradigm. So this post-war liberal paradigm, which was something like this, the middle class is going to expand more and more and more. We're going to become, we're all going to become more rational, um, uh, more affluent, better educated. Technology is going to make our lives better and better and better. Modern medicine is going to help us live longer and longer and longer. Blah, 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 blah. Basically, liberal, rational optimism. This is what the late 20th century was built on, a kind of liberal, rational optimism about the post-war liberal capitalist world, basically. And and these events, also including 9/11, basically ruined that. They burst the bubble for that. And um, it's really coming to terms with that reality, coming to terms with the change in the very way we imagine society and the future. Um, Fundamentally, how we value things, how we envision the future, and what we invest our hope in, our enthusiasm, our energy in, is has been since the end of World War II, this kind of liberal optimist rationalism. And these events basically ruin that. So you kind of have like what you might say in like very simple, common psychological language, a kind of defense mechanism or like a kind of coping mechanism. As we say online, that's cope. Someone is like denying reality, they're coping. You have a kind of coping mechanism, a disavowal, as Slavoj Žižek puts, is a kind of disavowal of the situation. We don't want to acknowledge that the very way we see the world, the very things we invest our hope and energy in, our values, our identities, are all being radically challenged by these events. And there's a kind of refusal to acknowledge that. And I think it's here in this refusal that you actually see the peak events, um, not necessarily in the events themselves, but sort of the culture and the psychology which is triggered, use the word trigger, by these events themselves. Now, the other factor here is that emotional synchronization is, and here's my argument, and here's why this is happening, effective, extremely effective, but only for a short period of time. It's like doing a sprint and not a marathon. Um, it's short term, short sighted. It's powerful, but in a very short term and short sighted sense. Um, if these sorts of events, OA crash and, for example, Ukraine war and 9/11 and so forth, sort of challenge our our political structures and our kind of moral and ideological identities, we could say. Um, there's a sort of a pressure and a need to adapt to that and overcome that and change. And in a system that doesn't want to do that, a system that doesn't want to overadapt and change, because of profit, power, ideological attachment, and all the usual reasons that some people or something might reject, or a system might reject change, you're going to have uh, power interests, we could say, in the system that are not like regulating that kind of intensive, in this case, kind of hysteric energy, and they're utilizing it for, for their own profit, power, and also political longevity. We see this, for example, within the internet. The clicks are the new form of kind of staying relevant and therefore making money by advertising. And you kind of want people to be constantly engaged in the media ecosystem. Now, that's just a kind of critique of the media ecosystem, which is kind of politically neutral. You can have a right wing, left wing, center version of a profit driven establishment that's trying to get advertising and therefore trying to get clicks the whole time. I mean, that's exactly what Elon Musk is doing with Twitter. He's trying to make it profitable with advertisers, and in doing so, he's kind of ruining the site, even though he's allowed a kind of ideological plurality to take over it. Like, there's no censoring of people who aren't sufficiently liberal, we could say. But at the same time, he's introduced these sort of mechanisms to get more clicks, uh, which has kind of turned the website a little bit into like TikTok or something. It's really terrible. So this emotional synchronization is more than just political and ideological. It's also just kind of technological and um, uh, economic as well, right? Changes in the media landscape and how that affects everything. But nonetheless, there is there has clearly been, I think, within the old institutions, within the kind of post-war establishment, um, political, educational, and so forth, there has been I think, a very clear allowance, very dangerous and very stupid, I think, allowance of a certain kind of hysterical emotional energy, collective emotional energy, because it leads to things which can be, which from the kind of power perspective can be useful, such as cancellation to kind of purge institutions of people who are challenging the systems or the status quo in any way. This happened actually on the left, probably most intensely than anywhere else. People forget this. If you go to this '08 crash period here, where my mouse is, and you go to this period and this massive rise in this kind of cultural hysteria, going up to this kind of peak in the late 2010s. Um, all this time, like anyone who was worth anything on the left was being purged from all the institutions which people on the left used to thrive in, such as academia or political organizations and so forth. Anyone who wasn't appropriately liberal, progressive, which basically also means kind of emotionally synchronized effectively into a kind of hive mind of kind of hyper tolerance, was just purged, and anyone who was hanging on to using their reason faculties was purged. And this happened, I think, most intensely at first on the left itself, but then it just kind of spread out into the whole society in every which way you could imagine. Eventually, the media was only complete, unthinking idiots were operating in the mainstream media, within universities, within institutions, every other kind of aspect of life, just social groups and workplace groups. If they weren't aggressively kind of conditioning people's kind of ideological disposition, they were at least creating environments where people were not comfortable in speaking freely and openly about anything at all. And I won't list off all the kind of cultural phenomena and events which this led to. You can kind of figure that out for yourself. But it reached the kind of peak, and going back to the argument I made earlier about people that predicted this stuff would kind of go away eventually, or kind of adapt and start to contain itself eventually, or people thought it would just indefinitely go up. Um, there are rules to civilization, right? Now, these rules are contradicted and changed and challenged by, particularly, I think, changes in technology, among other things. Generational character plays a role. I'm going to get onto that as well. That's another part of the analysis I want to do. But there are rules to the game. So there's this German sociologist of the mid 20th century called Norbert Elias. He wrote a book, a really good book, which I recommend everyone read, called The Civilizing Process. And one of the arguments he makes in that book is that basically civilization, particularly modern civilization, is a process of trying to get this zero level marker hit. You see this zero between the emotional energy between Marcus Aurelius and this kind of super outraged screaming woman. You have zero. Zero is a kind of balance. It's the state by which we're emotionally regulated and controlled, but we're not like completely and utterly sort of lacking in energy or enthusiasm, because that can lead to problems like kind of depression or hopelessness. Um, in a Also in a capitalist society, being excessively stoic and controlled is actually not very good either, because we don't, you know, eh, capitalist societies want us to desire things and to work for things, to save up for things, to consume things, to try things. It needs us to operate on a certain level of enthusiasm. Um, eh, but I would say generally civilization source to experience significant problems if everyone's an absolute stoic. If everyone's an absolute stoic, it probably is the best thing for us in the world, but it's not necessarily the best thing for civilization itself. Um, if you go to the other end of this, and everyone's super wired, super, enthusiastic, um, all the time, very, very high energy. This is also really, really, in the long term, it's really, really bad for any society or any civilization. And I think that what you're seeing here is basically these rules of there's certain rules of civilization, and those things still remain despite the media propaganda complexes, despite all the changes um, which have come about technologically, educationally, medically, and pharmaceutically. All this stuff, there are still some basic rules to the game. And I think that in the short term, you can go radically in one direction, but over the long term, things will have to balance out. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing here. Um, I put in a picture of Jordan Peterson here as well in this sort of peak period, because I do also want to point out that one of the still unrecognized peculiarities of the 2010s is that kind of famous psychologists became like world famous household names that everyone knows about. And that is interesting, but it would make perfect sense if you think about the period going through this peak, emotionally volatile, super hysterical moment. If you remember those early footages of Jordan Peterson in the Canadian universities, and he's sort of like walking around the courtyard, and there's all these like left wing protests. It was like left wing protests, and there's also some like right, it's kind of more conservative people. Uh, and he kind of steps in the middle of it, and he basically kind of acts like a dad who's come home from work, and all the kids are fighting, and the place is just a mess and chaotic, and he tries to just kind of order everything, kind of regulate everything, and he was completely unable to do this. If you watch those videos, like no one cares, no one's listening to him. He's just getting angrier and angrier. It doesn't work, and he himself ended up eventually in a coma, um, with some kind of vague peculiar health problems in Russia. I don't know how he ended up there. Anyway, the point is that like it's it this whole period, it became very clear that something needed to step in and regulate this stuff. That it was dangerous and it was in the long term extremely unsustainable, and that there was strange forces out there that were deliberately indulging and wielding and perpetuating this extremely high level hysterical kind of public energy, and certain people tried to step in and regulate that, and I think made careers out of it in some sense. Like wrote books and did podcasts and all that, and I think influenced many people in a positive way, but generally speaking, couldn't regulate this complete whirlwind of a mess that was going on here. Eventually, the only thing that can really regulate it is political. I think it's hierarchical, and so this need for like politics and hierarchy is extremely offensive to all of our post-war liberal, rational, optimistic perspectives. Because what we want, and I think in this sense, this is why Jordan Peterson, despite his best intentions and despite his like moral and emotional opposition to the forces of hysteria that we're discussing here, um, even he himself was in some sense a cope, even by his own fans, because there's an assumption here that like as kind of a kind of rational psychological mechanism that deals with people clinically on a one-to-one basis, uh, or a well-intended sort of school teacher, university professor, dad figure could could simply step in at a certain point of um, total unregulated collective emotional character and like simply just order things again, and it can't, absolutely can't. It's very clear actually that the only thing that can really order things again and get us back towards like a more zero level functioning society is 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 like non clinical but like political authority hierarchy and so forth. People don't want to hear that, but that's just the reality of civilization, in my opinion. So I found this meme on Twitter, and I thought it was, first of all, hilarious, but secondly, sort of fitting of the time we're in, because you see Trump here with his smug face, coming up very hopefully and very kind of angelically over the horizon, and these tulips of screaming liberals um, all over this field. And I think this is brilliant because it shows you actually that the only people that are going to win at the end of the day, the only people that are going to overcome are those that are in this period are those that can sort of endure the pressure and intensity of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is extremely effective in the short term, but someone like Trump is basically playing a game of like a kind of psychological social marathon. He's like enduring it for this extended period of time, and eventually he understands that this energy will exhaust itself. This energy will sort of like a child having a tantrum, sort of uh, eventually it will get tired and it will give up and it will fall asleep. Trump seems to have like his real intuitive understanding of how this works. I don't know why. Um, I'm not sure like where he got this from, but this is basically why he's been successful. I think as a political figure today, because he he psychopolitically understands this energy. Maybe he grew up with a sibling like this or something. I don't know, but he understands his energy and he understands what to do with it. Whereas it seems to me that everyone else around him didn't understand what to do with this energy, including the famous psychologists, including the other politicians, including the people who work in these institutions and so forth. No one really understood it. He did. Okay, so here's another factor to all this, and this is the generational components to this. And this is again something I've been talking about, and no one else has been taking seriously. As usual, you get the real shit here, and everyone else ignores the important stuff. Anyway, the ages of the voters is seems to be for Trump highest in the 45 to 64 category. Um, and I think that is significant because that is the Gen X category, right? And one thing I've noticed about a lot of the people around Trump is that they're more or less Gen Xers. Um, I think pretty much all his kind of well known figures, I think except for JD Vance, who's like a millennial, is a Gen X um, age group. So this is another aspect to civilization which has gone terribly wrong within the kind of post-war regime, and it's that the boomers have absolutely no idea they have no idea, and they won't accept a transition from one uh, from one style of authority or moral character of a society to another. The boomers were brought up under this idea that this post-war liberal rationalist optimism that I described at the start of this video would basically just extend and perpetuate itself for 1,000 years, if not longer. It would be like a kind of new Rome that would just go on and on and on for 1,000 years unchallenged. Um, and because of that, I think the authorities, like the generational character to the authorities of the society, and now Biden, for example, was a good example of this because he was a senile old man. Um, is living a kind of fever dream of that era, and it's conflated that era with eternity. It's conflated a very, very particular set of conditions um, after World War II in the West. It's conflating that with a kind of eternal disposition of civilization itself. So they've kind of completely neglected, if not neglected, full on refused to accept a challenging, distinct kind of character, energy, or ideas into the system. And this isn't just politics. I think the whole institutional fabric of Western societies eventually became this way. A complete refusal to facilitate any distinction. Um, and this eventually led to this kind of cancellation culture, purging anything challenging from the institutional character. And one aspect to this is tolerance. So tolerance is a kind of social civil character trait, which is very important in liberalism. It is to some extent important, I think, for any society, any sort of complex civilization at all, needs to be somewhat sufficiently tolerant. Um, but it's particularly important for modern liberal societies. And the middle classes basically have emerged out of this character ideal. In Freudian terms, it would be called like an ego ideal. It's a kind of shared sensibility about how we should be, our moral character, and it becomes largely entrenched, I think, in the conditioning processes of the society, its educational, workplace conditioning processes, and these processes are trying to constantly condition people that are kind of tolerant. Uh, but I think what's happened in the over the course of kind of post-war liberalism is that this value of tolerance has become kind of reductive. Like it's expelled out of it every other aspect of human nature, human psychology, to the point of absolute ridiculousness. So what you see emerging with what we call wokeness, which caused all the populist reaction, which led to Trump and so forth, is that you see that the only way to be considered a good person, a respectable person, is to kind of performatively show how tolerant you are. So every other virtue out there, courage, prudence, temperance, this is speaking in very classical terms, but you know what I mean, is expelled. There's no other there's no other virtue. The only recognizable virtue, the kind of social currency that we're trading in terms of prestige and reputation, all becomes like any performatively tolerant. If you're performatively tolerant, you're a good person. If you're not, you're a bad person. It becomes reductive and stupid, and it's dysfunctional. Um, it's a kind of religion or a faith with only one virtue and one vice. So think of Christianity. There's many different virtues in Christianity. There's as many different vices in Christianity. There's seven deadly sins. In the kind of liberalism we came to experience in the late 20th and early 21st century, it's a religion with one virtue, be as tolerant as possible, and one vice, be intolerant in any way, shape, or form, which leads to these stupidities, all these contradictions, and so on and so forth. And I think that this is very entrenched in the boomer generation. I think that the boomer generation has very much has a problem with this. They have a problem with this. Like they don't get they have a very reductive and simplistic, and I would say in some sense very childish and cheap understanding of human character and human moral, the complexity of a human moral universe, right? They have a very cheap one, very reductive one, and they've shown to be completely unable to adapt to a more sophisticated, nuanced, distinct ego ideal moral character. And again, I think this is where Trump prospers because he was offending that one virtue. Oh, be emotionally sympathetic, be tolerant. Why don't you feel sorry for these people? Why are you being rude to these people? Why are you offending people? And he just kept going. He just kept going. He just says, like I'm just gonna sit here and offend you all and smile because he understood on some level uh, that that these people are sort of deranged, that they've reduced human virtue and human morality to this simplistic game, which isn't real and will eventually break and tire itself and go away. And he was right. And I think his popularity is also based off of the desire for younger generations to push past that dogmatism, the kind of dogmatism of the liberal boomers. The other aspect this um, this Trump victory that we can analyze is also the role of men in society. So you know, post-war liberal societies, they post-war, so the kind of the war, the moral value of certain aspects of masculinity from warfare was kind of done away with. Well, pretty much totally done away with some exceptions. And then this kind of deindustrialized information economy um, also did away with like the value of basically forms of production and labor are which men favor and are better at, towards this kind of a feminized office economy and blah 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 blah. And again, I think that this is a complete blind spot of the kind of liberal post-war regime. They don't really see this as being a thing. They sort of have this like arrogant liberal uh, moral accusations towards these towards men in general who are unhappy, unsatisfied, or don't feel valued in their society. They have this really kind of sociopathological almost view of these people as if they're just losers. This is particularly pernicious and crazy and deranged view of people uh, that has festered, particularly more in America, I think, than Europe. I mean, I think that Europe is better when it comes to this issue. Um, Although the English speaking parts of Europe have been quite, in my experience, have been quite negatively affected by this, at least in the middle classes anyway. But this sort of view of like these people in the flyover states, it's kind of post-industrialized flyover states of the U.S., as if the reason that they're all on opioids and miserable and hate society and are losers and blah blah is simply because they're just losers. They just don't work hard enough. They're just not well educated enough, and all this stuff. It reduces it to the simple accusation that they haven't sort of effectively adapted their sort of skills, education, character, and emotional inner world to the standards of this sort of kind of post post masculinity, post industrial society. And I mean, these are places that are probably historically quite masculine and have are used to living in towns where people do real physical work, and that whole character just is the nature of them and the nature of where they live and their people and their families and everything. And they're expected to suddenly adapt very very quickly to something completely different, and in many ways, in most ways, I would say different in a very unfavorable and fetishized way. So it's not even asking them to adapt to something like long termly realistic. It's asking them to adapt to a kind of post war liberal fetish of how things should be, kind of hyper tolerant. Um, uh, the entire sort of moral universe being reduced to how tolerant you are, working in an office, being well educated, having these kind of fashionable opinions, and so on and so forth. And the failure to simply click their fingers and adapt to this successfully, socially, emotionally, so economically, technologically, everything, just leads to nothing more than a moral accusation. And it actually reminds me a little bit of something which the historian Emmanuel Todd points out in his recent book, The Defeat of the West, which is that there's moments when liberalism does this. It just has this like nauseating accusational moralism, and it doesn't give any people anything to work with. He uses the Irish famine as a good example of this. So you had a time when, due to the kind of imposition of the the basically unfair ownership of land in the country, and also the bad management of the land, which was due to the stupidity of the occupiers, the British Empire, um, led to a famine. And the only answer to these starving peasants was like, well, we're not going to give you food for free. You know, you have to build these roads. And now in Ireland, you have these like winding roads that go through the countryside. And it's this sort of liberal moralism of like kind of almost kind of sociopathological incapacity to understand people that don't fit a certain liberal ideal. This flares up every now and again in history, in the history of liberalism, and it really is a problem. Like it really is a problem. Um, and what you're seeing on this stupid little graph that I've made is basically this problem again, all over again, flaring up. But the difference is, and the even more worrying thing is that rather than kind of like a kind of very liberal society kind of treating people it sees as outsiders, like Irish peasants or the Indians or Africans or something, in this way. It's treating its own people in this way. It's treating its own people in this way, and you've seen that manifest through this this sort of arrogant middle class hatred of working class character, traditional masculinity, of so on and so forth. And again, I think this is just come back to bite them all in the ass for a second time.